The rumble of the ferry's engines was a dull thrum against Dean's ribs, a vibration he welcomed as a distraction from the hollow ache that had taken root deep inside him. He leaned against the rusty railing, the salt-laced wind whipping strands of dark hair across his face, stinging his eyes until they watered. The mainland, a smudge of gray and green, receded into the bruised horizon. He watched it shrink, a part of him hoping it would simply vanish, taking with it the bitter memories that clung to him like barnacles to a hull. This island, his grandfather's island, it was meant to be an escape, a place where the crushing weight of grief might finally lift, or at least be diluted by the vast, indifferent ocean. He'd packed his cartography tools, his meticulously inked maps of forgotten coastlines, his compasses, all the precision instruments that had once offered him solace in a world of variables. Now even those felt like fragile anchors, barely holding him against the tide of his own sorrow. The solicitor had called it an inheritance, a final, unexpected gesture from a man Dean had barely known, a reclusive lighthouse keeper whose life had ended as anonymously as it had begun. To Dean, it felt more like a summons to an exile he hadn't chosen, yet couldn't refuse. The fog, a thick, milky curtain, began to descend as the ferry approached the island's craggy shore. It swallowed the distant horizon, then the choppy gray water, until the world narrowed to the immediate, churning wake. When the ferry finally docked with a jarring lurch, the ramp groaned down onto a small, weathered pier. A single figure, a burly boatman with a face carved by wind and sun, stood waiting. He gave Dean a curt nod, his gaze lingering a moment too long, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes before he gestured vaguely towards a narrow, overgrown track leading away from the dock. "That's your path," the boatman grunted, his voice raspy. "The cottage is a fair walk. No vehicles this side." He didn't offer to help with Dean's heavy bags, which felt appropriate. Dean hadn't come here for company. The path was less a track and more a faint scar on the earth, winding through gnarled, salt-blasted shrubs and skeletal trees that clawed at the mist. The silence was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls and the distant, rhythmic sigh of the waves. He walked for what felt like an hour, the fog thickening around him, reducing visibility to mere yards. Through a momentary thinning of the fog, Dean caught sight of a massive, hulking structure to his left, partially obscured but undeniably immense. It was a derelict factory, a skeleton of rusted girders and shattered windows, its brickwork crumbling, its colossal chimney stack a broken finger pointing accusingly at the sky. It stood like a monument to a forgotten industry, a testament to ambition that had long since been devoured by the elements. He quickened his pace, the image of escaping maw lingering in his mind. Finally, the path opened onto a wind-swept bluff. There it stood, the lighthouse keeper's cottage. It wasn't the picturesque, whitewashed image from postcards. This was a squat, stone dwelling, its slate roof mottled with lichen, its windows like vacant eyes peering out from beneath heavy brows of moss. A thick wooden door, warped by decades of sea spray, creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo the cottage's own weariness. The interior was a mausoleum of forgotten time. The air was heavy, smelling of damp earth, salt, and something else, a faint, almost sweet decay, like old flowers pressed between the pages of an ancient book. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy window panes. He walked through the small, sparsely furnished rooms, a living area with a stone hearth, a kitchen with a rusted sink, and a bedroom containing a narrow cot. Everything was covered in a fine, powdery layer of dust, a testament to the years of his grandfather's absence, or perhaps the decades of his solitary presence. Dean ran a hand over a wooden mantelpiece, disturbing a cloud of gray. He felt the profound weight of the place, the layers of solitude that had settled into the very timbers of the house. As he stood in the center of the living room, the only sound the distant, mournful wail of the foghorn, Dean felt an odd pressure in his ears, a subtle shift in the air. He blinked, attributing it to the change in elevation, the dampness. But then, a faint, rhythmic tap seemed to emanate from the floorboards beneath his feet. It was too soft to be rats, too irregular to be the house settling. He stood perfectly still, straining his ears, his breath held. The tapping stopped. He waited, his heart thrumming a little faster against his ribs. Not that, only the sigh of the wind outside, the distant foghorn. He told himself it was just the old house, playing tricks on his frayed nerves. He was tired, grieving, desperate for a quiet corner to mend. This was that corner. He had to believe it was. He spun around, his eyes sweeping the empty space. He rubbed his temples, a dull ache beginning to throb behind his eyes. And he, Dean, was now at its heart. The ferry's horn, a mournful bellow, echoed across the water as it pulled away, leaving Dean on the small, isolated dock. The island was a silhouette of jagged rock and wind-bent pines under a sky the color of bruised plums. His grandfather's cottage, a squat, stone structure, clung to a cliff face, its unlit windows like vacant eyes staring out at the churning gray expanse. The air here was different, heavier, thick with the scent of brine and damp earth, carrying a faint, metallic tang he couldn't quite place. He hauled his single duffel bag up the gravel path, the silence of the place pressing in on him, a vast, unbroken quiet punctuated only by the distant shriek of gulls and the relentless sigh of the ocean. Inside, the cottage was cold and still, a mausoleum of forgotten memories. Dean spent the first few days in a fog of unpacking and quiet grief, trying to impose order on the chaos of his new life and the greater chaos within him. He mapped the interior of the cottage in his mind, noting the peeling wallpaper, the antique brass telescope pointed uselessly at the ceiling, the faint, lingering smell of pipe tobacco and decay. He walked the perimeter of the island daily, a cartographer's instinct compelling him to understand its contours, its hidden coves and treacherous shoals. He needed something concrete, something measurable to anchor him. It was during these walks that the first anomalies began to prick at his carefully constructed calm. The tides, for instance. He'd always understood the ocean as predictable, governed by the moon's unwavering pull. But here, the water behaved erratically. One afternoon, the tide receded so far, so quickly, it exposed an improbable stretch of barnacle-encrusted rock and slick, black sand that he hadn't seen before. The next day, it would surge in with a surprising force, licking at the base of the cottage steps higher than any chart indicated it should. He checked his tide tables, consulted old maritime almanacs he'd found in a dusty cupboard. Nothing explained it. He tried to rationalize it as local currents, an unusual confluence of weather patterns, anything but a deviation from the natural order. At first, he dismissed them as the wind, whistling through the gaps in the cottage, old stone walls, or the mournful cry of distant gulls. But as the days bled into one another, the indistinct murmurs grew more insistent, more complex. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried the cadence of conversation, a low, guttural lilt that seemed to rise from the very depths of the ocean. He'd be standing by the window, watching the fog roll in, and hear them, a chorus of unintelligible voices swirling around the cottage, pressing against the glass. He was a man of maps, of precise measurements, not spectral voices. One blustery afternoon, while exploring a rarely visited part of the island, Dean stumbled upon a sprawling, skeletal structure half hidden by a thicket of gnarled trees. It was a derelict factory, its corrugated iron roof rusted through in places, its windows shattered like vacant eyes. A forgotten relic of some bygone industry, perhaps fishing or canning. He moved through the cavernous space, his boots crunching on fallen debris, a strange sense of compulsion guiding him. He wasn't sure why he was there, but he felt an inexplicable pull, as if the place held an answer to the growing unease he carried. In a forgotten corner, beneath a collapsed section of roof, nestled amongst a pile of warped wooden crates, he found it. A small, leather-bound journal, its cover swollen and discolored by water damage, its pages warped and brittle. It was his grandfather's, identifiable by the faded inscription on the first page, a crude drawing of a lighthouse and a familiar, looping signature. Dean's hands trembled as he opened it. The ink was faded, some passages illegible, but what remained sent a shiver down his spine. The entries were sporadic, rambling, a desperate man's attempt to document something unspeakable. There were observations about the tides echoing his own unsettling experiences, but his grandfather's tone was frantic, no longer rationalizing. Then came the sketches, grotesque, abstract forms that seemed to writhe on the page, like things glimpsed in a nightmare, and recurring phrases, scrawled in a hasty hand, sometimes underlined multiple times. The deep song, they call to me. The pact is broken, and it hungers for the shore. Dean's breath hitched. He wasn't just hearing things. He wasn't just imagining the erratic tides. His grandfather had seen it too, whatever it was. The rational explanations he had clung to, the scientific dismissals, began to crumble around him like the factory's decaying walls. Dean's breath hitched. He wasn't just hearing things. He wasn't just imagining the erratic tides. His grandfather had seen it too, whatever it was. He clutched the journal, its damp leather cool against his palm, the whispers outside the derelict factory walls seeming to coalesce to form a discernible, guttural murmur that sent a shiver through him. He didn't wait to hear more. He stumbled from the derelict factory, the journal tucked securely under his arm, the sea wind a brutal slap against his face. The fog, a relentless shroud, pressed in, distorting the familiar path back to the cottage. He reached the solitude of his inherited home, locking the heavy oak door behind him with a definitive thud that did little to quiet the clamor in his mind. He spread the journal across the scarred oak table in the small living room, its pages still slightly damp. Dean, a cartographer by trade, his mind accustomed to patterns and precision, now found himself adrift in a sea of his grandfather's frantic scrawls. He traced the faded ink, the looping script that had once seemed indecipherable now slowly yielding its secrets. Phrases emerged from the chaos, the deep one's ancient pact. The price of the light. His grandfather hadn't just been a lighthouse keeper. He had been a guardian, a watchman against something formless and terrifying. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Dean turned to the island's sparse history. He found a collection of old, brittle books his grandfather had kept, tucked away in a dusty cabinet. There were no official records of any pact, no mention of deep ones in the local archives he'd briefly glimpsed on the mainland. Tales of a forgotten fishing village swallowed by the sea, not in a storm, but in a single, silent night. Legends of offerings made to the ocean, of fishermen who vanished without a trace, their boats found empty, barnacled, and drifting. One passage spoke of the sea beneath the waves, a place of impossible architecture and unholy reverence, guarded by things that predated humanity. He cross-referenced the journal's cryptic days with old tide charts and astronomical observations he found among his grandfather's meticulous notes. The anomalies were stark, periods of unusually low tides, followed by surges that defied natural explanation. These coincided precisely with the journal entries describing the stirring, the awakening. His grandfather hadn't just observed the sea, he tracked its malevolent pulse. It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a literal agreement, a bargain struck with something ancient and powerful. A price paid for the island's continued existence, for the light in the tower to keep burning. And his grandfather had been the keeper, not just of the light, but of the pact itself. A shiver snaked down Dean's spine. What was the price? And who was paying it now? That night, Dean's dreams became a suffocating descent. He was falling, endlessly, towards a distant, shimmering light that was not a beacon of hope, but a lure, a trap. He awoke with a gasp, his body slick with sweat, his throat raw. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the lingering echo of the dream. He swung his legs out of bed, the wooden floorboards icy beneath his bare feet. As he moved toward the small kitchen to fetch water, his gaze fell upon the windowsill. There, nestled between the peeling paint and the grimy glass, was a patch of something alien. It wasn't mold, nor was it any moss he recognized. It was a cluster of tiny, gelatinous tendrils pulsating with a faint, ethereal blue-green light. Bioluminescent. He leaned closer, his breath catching. It smelled faintly of ozone and something rotten, like stagnant water from a forgotten depth. He touched it, tentatively. It was cool and strangely firm, yet slimy to the touch. He recoiled, staring at the glowing growth. It wasn't just on the windowsill. He found another, smaller patch clinging to the underside of the kitchen counter, and then a faint, almost invisible smear of the same luminous substance on the brass knob of the front door just above the lock. It was subtle, insidious, a creeping invasion. The island's secrets were confined to old journals and forgotten legends. They were seeping into his reality, glowing in the dim light, a silent, terrifying testament to a presence that was no longer just stirring beneath the waves, but actively encroaching upon his very home. The pact, whatever it truly was making itself known. The derelict factory air hung heavy, a shroud of dust and decay that clung to Dean's lungs, made his teeth ache. The whispers, which had been a distant murmur, now pressed in, a sibilant chorus rising from the rusting machinery and the damp, crumbling walls. They weren't just wind or settling timbers. They were voices, or the raw, unformed idea of voices, like a language before words, bubbling up from a fathomless depth. He clutched his grandfather's journal, its worn leather a fragile anchor against the encroaching dread. The sound seemed to coalesce, not into speech, but into a pressure against his eardrums, a resonant thrum that vibrated through the soles of his boots. This wasn't a place to linger. He spun on his heel, his worn boots crunching on scattered debris, and stumbled toward the gaping maw of the factory entrance. He didn't look back, couldn't. The fog, usually a comforting blanket, now felt like a living thing coiling around his legs, obscuring the path back to the cottage. Every gust of wind seemed to carry a faint, saline tang, but beneath it, something else, a metallic, briny scent like rust and stagnant tidal pools. He jogged, then ran, the journal still pressed against his chest, its dampness seeping into his shirt. He felt watched, not just by the island's indifferent gulls, but by something that moved beneath the waves, something that had noticed his intrusion into the factory's forgotten secrets. He leaned against it, chest heaving, the metallic tang of fear sharp on his tongue. The cottage, however, offered no true refuge. A low, resonant hum began, almost imperceptible at first, like the distant vibration of a ship's engine, but it quickly grew. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears as much as one he felt in his bones, a deep thrumming that resonated in his teeth, vibrated up through the floorboards. It was hypnotic, disorienting, making the very air feel thick and viscous. Dean pushed himself away from the door, his gaze sweeping the familiar, cluttered room. He watched, transfixed, as a framed photograph of his grandfather, perched precariously on a bookshelf, subtly shifted. Not a tremor from the floor, not a draft. It simply slid an inch to the left, then stopped. A moment later, a ceramic teacup on the small table beside his armchair glided a fraction of an inch across the polished wood, its base scraping faintly. Dean stared, his breath catching. He blinked, hard, telling himself it was the hum playing tricks on his perception, the residual fear from the factory distorting his vision. But the photograph remained off-kilter, the teacup visibly out of place. He gripped the edge of the porcelain sink, gazing into the tarnished mirror above it. His reflection stared back, pale and haggard, eyes wide with a fear he was rapidly losing the ability to deny. Then, a subtle distortion. The edges of his reflected face seemed to waver, to stretch, elongating slightly, as if seen through disturbed water. He blinked hard, and the distortion vanished, leaving only his terrified face. He leaned closer, scrutinizing the glass, but it remained a mundane, speckled surface. The hum was a constant now, a deep, pervasive note that permeated the cottage, seeming to settle in the very marrow of his bones. He grabbed the journal, needing answers, needing to understand what his grandfather had been battling. He flipped through the water-stained pages, past the frantic scrawls and the increasingly desperate tone. One entry, marked with a heavy, almost violent underline, caught his eye. It hungers. It demands. His grandfather hadn't just been trying to ward something off, he'd been appeasing it. Driven by a sudden, desperate intuition, Dean began to search. He moved through the cottage, his senses heightened by the humming and the lingering fear. Beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry, hidden behind a stack of dusty tins, he found a small, crude wooden box. There were also dried remnants of something organic, something that smelled faintly of salt and decay, but also of something alien, something that didn't belong to the land or the sea he knew. He recognized the symbols carved into the underside of the box's lid, crude, looping designs that matched some of the frantic sketches in his grandfather's journal. Warding symbols, yes, but also disturbingly, symbols that looked like offerings. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature made him shiver. The metallic, briny scent from outside intensified, thick and suffocating. The hum deepened, becoming a guttural growl, a vast, resonant chord that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. It had no discernible shape, no eyes, no limbs, yet Dean felt its gaze, its vast, ancient hunger. But it didn't dissipate. He felt its vast, alien intelligence, its profound indifference, and its insatiable hunger. This wasn't a delusion. This was a real. His grandfather's words, the journal, the things he'd seen, it was all true. And it was here. The last entry had been a brutal blow. The words echoed, a hollow clang in the small, silent cottage. Dean moved with a frantic energy, his earlier careful inspection replaced by a desperate scramble. He tore through drawers, flung open cupboard doors, his fingers scraping against rough wood and cold ceramic. This wasn't a logbook, it was personal, intimate. The handwriting was his grandfather's, precise yet increasingly erratic in later entries. The initial pages detailed mundane observations, weather patterns, supply deliveries, the dwindling fishing hauls. But then, a shift. It needs, the agreement holds, a portion. His grandfather had documented a ritual, not an ancient, forgotten one, but his ritual, a grim, meticulous accounting of what was given and what was taken. Dates were noted, specific moon cycles, the tides. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as the wind or the distant groan of the sea against the rocks. But it deepened, gaining a resonant quality, like a colossal bell tolling underwater, too vast for human ears to truly comprehend. It wasn't just sound. It was a pressure, a subtle shift in the very air around him. The words on the page seemed to shimmer, the ink blurring at the edges. It wasn't his eyes, or the growing unease settling like a shroud around his perception. He flipped forward, his fingers trembling. An entry from years ago, scrawled in a hand that was almost unrecognizable. The old factory. It holds the remnants. The proper offering must be prepared. The blood salt. The bone meal. The currents demand it. The derelict factory. Dean remembered seeing it, a skeletal structure of rusted iron and crumbling brick, hunched on the far side of the island, half swallowed by the encroaching coastal scrub. He'd assumed it was just a relic, another decaying monument to a forgotten industry. But his grandfather, he'd been using it. For what? The deep song intensified, a pervasive, insidious melody that seemed to bypass his ears and burrow directly into his brain. He could feel it in his teeth, a dull ache, a persistent buzz. He clenched his jaw, trying to focus, trying to push back against the creeping disorientation. Was this what his grandfather had endured? This constant, psychological erosion? He closed the ledger, the leather cover cool against his clammy palm. The factory. He needed to see it, needed to understand what his grandfather had been doing there. It was a desperate impulse, a need to ground himself in something tangible, something that wasn't just the swirling chaos inside his head. The walk was a blur. The pervasive hum of the deep song seemed to distort the landscape, making the familiar path ripple at the edges of his vision. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood and rust. When he reached the derelict factory, The structure loomed, a jagged silhouette against the bruised sky. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the scent of decay and something else, something sharp and acrid. Rusting machinery stood like petrified beasts, draped in cobwebs. But it wasn't the machinery that drew his eye. On a grimy concrete slab, near what looked like an old processing vat, he saw them. Scratches, deep and deliberate, carved into the concrete. Not random graffiti, but symbols familiar from the ledger, though distorted, warped. A shudder ran through him. This wasn't just observation. This was active participation. His grandfather hadn't merely witnessed the entity's hunger. He had fed it. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Back at the lighthouse, the air felt thinner, though the deep song still reverberated. He clutched the ledger, his mind racing. The factory was a preparation site. The cottage was the living space. But where was the delivery? Where was the ultimate exchange made? He remembered a cryptic entry, almost illegible, about the heart of the light. He dismissed it as poetic ramblings. Now, it echoed with a sinister resonance. There had to be something more, a hidden passage, a forgotten access point. The deep song pulsed, urging him on, or perhaps luring him deeper. He ran his palm over a section of wall near the spiral staircase, feeling a slight unevenness, a subtle difference in the texture. He pressed, pushed, then noticed a small, almost invisible indentation, a button perhaps, or a latch. Dean peered into the blackness, the deep song now a guttural chant, echoing from the depths. He had found it, the chamber, the crypt, and he knew, with a horrifying certainty, that whatever lay beyond that threshold was the true heart of his grandfather's pact, the true heart of the island's secret. He had to. The rusted gate, a maw of jagged iron teeth, groaned a protest as Dean pushed it open. He'd seen it before, a skeletal monument to some forgotten industry, its brickwork crumbling like ancient bone, its windowpanes shattered, eyes staring blankly at the sea. Now, it felt different. Shrouded, a destination, not just a landmark. His grandfather's fragmented notes had finally yielded their secret, a crude sketch, barely decipherable, of a stylized anchor symbol next to a cross-section of the factory's foundation. He stepped onto the cracked asphalt, the crunch of loose gravel under his boots echoing in the oppressive quiet. The sheer scale of the place, even in ruin, was daunting. A giant, slumped beast of corrugated metal and skeletal girders, half swallowed by tenacious coastal scrub that clawed at its foundations. Inside, the vast chamber was a graveyard of defunct machinery. Dean moved with purpose, his determination a shield against the creeping unease. He traced the outline of the factory floor, referencing his grandfather's sketch, searching for the anger symbol. The symbol was faint, almost worn away by time, but unmistakable. He ran his fingers over the cold metal, a surge of adrenaline sharpening his senses. This was it. The wall behind the boiler was a patchwork of crumbling plaster and stained brick. He pushed, pulled, examined every seam, every loose brick. He pressed harder, and a faint click echoed in the vast space. A section of the wall, disguised expertly as part of the boiler's base, slid inward with a grinding protest, revealing a narrow, lightless passage. He hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to turn and run back to the safety of the cottage. But the mystery, the gnawing need to understand, propelled him forward. The tunnel was damp, the air thick and still. The walls were rough-hewn stone, sweating with moisture, slick under his fingertips. The floor sloped downwards, uneven and treacherous, forcing him to move slowly, deliberately. The passage twisted, turned, then opened into a cavern. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a chamber far larger than he'd anticipated. The air here was utterly still, heavy with that cloying sweetness, now so potent it made his teeth ache. In the center of the cavern, bathed in a dim, phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from within the very stone, sat a colossal, organic-looking mass. It wasn't an artifact in any traditional sense, no crafted metal or carved stone. It was a living, breathing thing, though utterly alien. At pulse, a slow, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the rock floor, reverberating in his chest. It was roughly spherical, but its surface was covered in undulating ridges, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and reform as he watched, like a constantly churning current. He took a hesitant step closer, then another, his flashlight beam trembling. The pulsating intensified, and the air around the mass shimmered, distorting the cavern walls. He could hear it now, not just feel it, a low, resonant hum, a deep-sea chant that bypassed his ears and resonated directly within his skull, vibrating through his very being. As he neared, the sweet, earthy scent intensified, and the swirling patterns on the mask coalesced, briefly forming what looked like eyes unblinking, impossibly vast, and utterly devoid of anything human. He stared into them, and the hum became a roar in his mind, a torrent of pure, raw sensation. Suddenly, he wasn't in the cavern anymore. He was everywhere. A horrifying vision slammed into his consciousness, not seen with his eyes, but felt experienced. He saw the lighthouse, his cottage, crumbling like sandcastles, dragged down into an unimaginable maw. He saw himself, or what was left of him, not drowning, but being unmade, his form dissolving, his consciousness scattering, becoming one with the countless, formless things that swarmed in the fathomless deep. A silent chorus of endless, consuming hunger. The very fabric of reality seemed to fray, revealing glimpses of unimaginable scales of something vast and indifferent, older than stars, stirring beneath the world. Then, just as suddenly, he was back in the cavern, gasping, stumbling backwards, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the damp stone, shivering uncontrollably. He knew what his grandfather had been trying to fight, what the island truly hid. It wasn't just a creature. It was an entity, a primordial force of dissolution, and it was awake. It was reaching, slowly but inexorably, for the island, for everything on it, for him. And Dean, the reclusive cartographer, was standing directly in its path. He had seen its intent. He would not let it happen. He'd seen it before, a skeletal monument to some forgotten industry, but never like this. Now, the hulking silhouette against the bruised sky felt less like a ruin and more like a waiting maw. He stepped inside, the iron gate clanging shut behind him with a finality that made the hairs on his arms prickle. Dust, thick and gray as ancient ash, coated everything. Light struggled to penetrate the grime-caked windows, painting the cavernous space in sickly, shifting shades of green and ochre. Twisted machinery, draped in cobwebs, loomed like petrified beasts, their purpose long forgotten. Every creak of the corroded corrugated iron roof, every sigh of the wind through broken panes, sounded amplified, distorted, as if the factory itself were breathing with a shallow, ragged gasp. Dean felt the space pressing in on him, the vast emptiness somehow more suffocating than any cramped room. He was trapped. A shiver, not of cold, but of profound unease, snaked down his spine. It wasn't just the factory, it was here. He felt it, a profound pressure against the inside of his skull, a subtle hum beneath the floorboards that vibrated up through his worn boots. It was present, palpable, coiling around him like invisible tendrils. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, trying to dispel the image that flashed unbidden behind his eyelids. Vast, crushing depths, endless blackness, and something moving within it. Something impossibly large and ancient. When he opened his eyes, the factory seemed to have shifted. A faint, slick sheen coated the floor in patches, reflecting the dim light with an unsettling, oily iridescence. He pressed a hand to his temple, a dull throb beginning to bloom there. It was trying to get in, to burrow its way past the fragile barriers of his mind. His thoughts felt sluggish, muddied, as if thick, cold water were flowing through his brain. No, he whispered, the sound swallowed by the vast, echoing space. He wouldn't let it. He had come here for answers, for a way to fight back, not to surrender. His fingers fumbled at the oilskin satchel slung across his chest, pulling out the heavy, leather-bound journal. He clutched it, knuckles white, and stumbled toward the collapsed workbench, clearing a space amidst the detritus of rusted tools and shattered glass. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning frantically, desperate for any insight, any instruction. His grandfather's precise script, usually so comforting in its meticulousness, now seemed to mock him with its cryptic entries, sketches of strange symbols, fragmented maps of the island, and then, the later pages, scrawled with a frantic, almost illegible hand. These were the ones he sought. His gaze snagged on a series of unsettling drawings, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe on the page, surrounded by dense, looping script. He could make out fragments of phrases, half-erased words, seal the breach, ancient pact, the final offering. His breath hitched. This was it. This was the core. The factory floor seemed to ripple, the air growing thick and viscous. It was closer now, pushing harder, trying to overwhelm him. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the journal. The script here was almost frantic, the words pressed hard into the paper, a sacrifice of self to bind the rift, the final severance, all that you hold dear. Gellin! He read it again, his eyes widening in horror. All that he held dear. The words resonated with a sickening clarity, twisting the knot of grief in his stomach. It wasn't just a life. It was something far more profound, far more terrible. It implied a complete undoing. a surrender of everything that made him Dean. Perhaps it meant a permanent exile from the world, a binding to the very thing he sought to repel, or worse, a sacrifice of the last vestiges of his past, the memories, the love, the pain that still tethered him to his lost life. The factory pulsed, the air vibrating with a silent, terrible roar. He gripped the journal so tightly the leather creaked. The answer was there, a desperate, horrifying truth. He could seal the portal, but the cost was absolute. He looked around the derelict factory, its decaying bones now seeming to mock his futile determination. The entity was here, within him, around him, and the only way to stop it was to offer up the very core of his being. The choice, stark and brutal, lay before him, a chasm opening at his feet. The words of the journal clawed at Dean's mind, a cold, insidious dread blossoming in his chest. All that he held dear. It wasn't just death, he realized with a sickening lurch. Death offered finality, a quiet oblivion. This implied something far worse, an erasure, a complete unmaking. He wouldn't just cease to be, he would cease to have been. His memories, his very existence, would be swallowed, leaving no trace behind. The thought was a vacuum, pulling at the threads of his identity, threatening to unravel him completely. Outside the cottage, the island groaned. The weather had turned feral in the last few hours, a monstrous tantrum of wind and water. Rain lashed against the glass like thrown pebbles, and the lighthouse beam, usually a comforting sweep, now seemed to cut through a solid wall of churning gray. He peered through a gap in the curtains, his breath fogging the pain. The familiar landscape was dissolving into a nightmare tableau. The gnarled trees, usually stout and resilient, now writhed like tortured limbs, their branches tearing away in the gale. He saw flashes of movement on the rocky shore below, not the graceful dive of gulls, but ungainly, lurching shapes, dark against the pale foam. Something was washing ashore, something wrong. He couldn't make out details, but the sheer unnaturalness of their forms, their distorted bulk, sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. His psychic pressure was immense, a constant, dull throb behind his eyes that threatened to split his skull. He clenched his jaw, gripping the leather-bound journal so tightly his knuckles ached. This was it, the final stand. His grandfather's scrawled notes, now fully deciphered, laid bare the terrifying truth of the pact and the desperate counter-ritual needed to sever the connection. He flipped to the last few pages, his gaze sweeping over the hurried, almost frantic handwriting. The derelict factory. It was the only location on the island that fit the description, and the cost it was reiterated there, stark and unforgiving. Now he was being asked to sacrifice not just his future, but his very past, his identity, the memory of that love that still haunted him. Yet, a strange, grim determination settled over him. If his existence was the price to save this island, to sever this ancient malevolent hold, then so be it. He gathered the few items listed, a shard of obsidian from the black beach, a handful of dried sea heather from the highest cliff, a vial of his own blood, drawn with a trembling hand moments ago. Each item felt heady, charged with a morbid significance. Stepping out of the cottage was like entering a different dimension. The wind immediately tore at him, a physical force that tried to push his back, to keep him contained. The air tasted of brine and something else, a coppery, almost sweet decay that prickled his nostrils. The path to the derelict factory, usually a 20-minute walk, now seemed an impossible journey through a landscape actively hostile. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, the earth itself seeming to resist his passage. Twisted roots, like petrified tentacles, snaked across the narrow track, threatening to trip him. The fog, denser than any he had ever witnessed, coiled around him, not merely obscuring vision, but seeming to press in, muffling sound, distorting shapes. He ignored them, focusing on the rhythmic clang of the lighthouse bell, now a discordant, frantic toll in the storm, a desperate heartbeat in the encroaching chaos. Finally, through a swirling curtain of mist and rain, the silhouette of the derelict factory loomed. It was a skeletal structure of rusted girders and crumbling brick, a monument to failed human ambition. Its broken windows were like empty eye sockets, staring out at the ravaged sea. As he approached, a profound silence fell, unnerving after the cacophony of the storm. This was the place, the heart of the counter-ritual. He pulled the journal from his coat, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. It was time. The wind, a furious, living thing, clawed at Dean as he stepped out into the island's tumultuous night. Rain lashed down, a cold, stinging assault, mirroring the chaotic storm brewing within him. He had understood the cost, the chilling arithmetic of a bargain made across eons. The entity demanded not just his future, but the very scaffolding of his past, the memories of his partner, the love that defined him, the grief that had brought him to this desolate place. A shudder, a deep, bone-rattling tremor coursed through him. It was a terrifying prospect, Yet a strange, grim determination had solidified in his gut. There was no other way. The ritual, transcribed in his grandfather's frantic hand, demanded an anchor, a tether to the original pact. It spoke of a place where the island's raw, industrial heart once pulsed, a site of the old keeper's clandestine dealings. The derelict factory. He gripped the heavy, weathered lantern, its beam a weak yellow eye against the churning blackness. The path was treacherous, slick with mud and seaweed, leading him away from the lighthouse's fading comfort and towards the island's interior. He pressed on, his jaw set, pushing past the insidious assault on his mind. The derelict factory loomed out of the mist like a skeleton, a hulking mass of rusted corrugated iron and shattered windows. He forced open a buckling service door, the groan of tortured metal echoing through the vast, empty space. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the dust of decades, dampness clinging to everything. Rust-colored rivulets snaked down concrete walls, pooling in shallow depressions on the floor. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the concrete floor, a sound that seemed to originate from beneath the earth itself. It was the entity, not yet fully manifest, but its influence was a palpable weight, pressing down on him, trying to crush his will. His breath hitched in his throat. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, as if the very fabric of reality within these walls was thinning, fraying at the edges. He followed the instructions, moving deeper into the factory's labyrinthine interior, past silent assembly lines and forgotten workstations. He found the specified chamber, a vast, circular space that must have once housed some colossal piece of machinery. In the center, a raised platform of discolored concrete, and there, etched into its surface, was the symbol his grandfather had drawn in his journal, a complex, interlocking pattern that seemed to writhe even in the dim light. As he stepped onto the platform, the hum intensified, vibrating through his teeth, rattling his bones. A vision slammed into his mind, his partner smiling, laughing, reaching for him. The image was so vivid, so real, he almost cried out. Then it began to twist, the smile stretching, the eyes widening into bottomless black pools, the laughter transforming into a gurgling, wet sound. The entity was weaponizing his love, turning his most cherished memories against him. No, Dean rasped, his voice raw. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently, forcing the grotesque image away. He knew this was its game, its insidious attempt to erode his resolve. He found it then, tucked into a small, weathered recess in the platform, a small, lead-encased box. The factory seemed to breathe around him, the metallic tang in the air now acrid, almost burning his nostrils. He had what he needed. Now, the lighthouse. Each footfall echoed, swallowed by the vastness, as if the building itself was closing in, trying to hold him captive. He burst out into the tumultuous night, gasping for breath, the rain a welcome assault after the suffocating interior. The journey back to the lighthouse was a gauntlet. The wind shrieked, a banshee's wail, and the sea roared with an unnatural fury. It was no longer subtle. The entity was here, fully manifested in the storm, in the churning waves, in the very air he breathed. The lighthouse door groaned open, revealing interior transformed. The familiar spiral staircase seemed to stretch into an infinite blackness above, the light from the lantern barely penetrating the unnatural gloom. The air thrummed with raw, alien power. The entity was not a creature of flesh and blood, but a force, a distortion of reality. He ascended the stairs, each step a Herculean effort against an invisible current. They promised oblivion, peace, if only he would surrender. But Dean pushed through. He had come too far. At the top, in the lantern room, the chaos was absolute. The glass panes rattled violently, but the storm outside seemed secondary to the one within. The air shimmered, warping the very light from the lantern, twisting it into grotesque patterns. He opened it, revealing not some monstrous relic, but a shimmering obsidian shard, pulsing with a faint malevolent light. This was it, the Eiger. He began to chant the words from his grandfather's journal, his voice trembling but resolute. The ancient syllables felt alien on his tongue, a language of things that predated humanity. As he spoke, the vortex howled, and the entity launched its final, most devastating assaults. Visions flooded his mind, his partner alive, vibrant, pleading with him not to do this, not to forget her. The memories were so potent, so real, they felt like physical blows. He saw their life together, every cherished moment, every shared laugh, every tender touch, all playing out in agonizing detail, trying to shatter his resolve, to make him cling to what he was about to lose. Tears streamed down Dean's face, blurring his vision, but he did not falter. This was the sacrifice, not just the memories, but the capacity for them, the very essence of his grief and love, the part of him that could asterisk remember. He was giving it all to seal this horror away. With a guttural cry, Dean plunged the obsidian shard into the heart of the swirling vortex. A deafening shriek erupted, not from the wind, but from the portal itself, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and rage. The room convulsed. He had paid the price. The vortex began to shrink, contracting violently, fighting against the seal. Dean, weakened, staggering, placed his hand on the lead box, focusing every ounce of his remaining will. The portal pulsed one last time, a final, desperate gasp, before collapsing inwards, vanishing as if it had never been there. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant, diminishing roar of the storm. Dean stood alone in the lantern room, the lighthouse beam sweeping its familiar arc across the now calmer sea. He felt nothing. He had saved the island, but at what cost to himself? The entity demanded an anchor, a tether to this world, not of flesh and bone, but of consciousness, of memory, of connection. And Dean, driven to the precipice of his sanity, was prepared to offer it. His breath hitched, a ragged sound lost in the gale. The path to the derelict factory was a treacherous ribbon of slick stone and mud, barely visible beneath the thrashing assault of the elements. Each step was a battle, his boots sinking into the saturated earth, the spray from the furious sea staining his eyes. The air grew thick with the scent of brine and decaying metal, a metallic tang that coated his tongue. It was eager, expectant. The main doors, long ripped from their hinges, offered no resistance. The factory floor stretched before him, a cathedral of decay. Twisted girders reached towards the unseen roof, skeletal fingers grasping at nothing. Rust-eaten machinery lay scattered like the bones of some forgotten beast, covered in a fine, gritty layer of dust and salt. The rain found its way through countless holes in the roof, creating a symphony of drips and splashes that echoed eerily in the vast space. Dean's gaze was drawn to the center of the vast chamber, where the ground was strangely clear, a circular depression in the concrete, almost like a massive drain. This was it. This was the locus. He walked towards it, his footsteps echoing too loudly. The pressure in his head intensified, a dizzying throb that threatened to split his skull. The hum was louder now, a resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very floor beneath his feet. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but with his bones, a fundamental frequency that vibrated through his core. The bargain, as he now understood it, was a transfer. His grandfather, the previous guardian, had done it, and now it was Dean's turn. He placed his hands on the grimy concrete, his vision blurred, the lantern light wavering as if struggling against an invisible current. The hum became a roar, not of sound, but of pure, raw consciousness pouring into him. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with a new, terrifying clarity, vast, formless, a crushing weight of ancient, indifferent hunger. It was the deep song, and it was singing directly into his soul. He felt the pull, a cosmic undertow threatening to unravel his very being, to stretch his consciousness across unthinkable distances. He cried out, a sound that was swallowed by the roaring presence, but he did not pull away. He couldn't. He was bound. The world twisted. He was a vessel, his mind a canvas upon which the entity painted its alien truth. The immediate the physical encroachment on the island receded. The storm outside began to wane, the wind softening, the rain easing. The entity had its anchor. When the last tendril of its direct invasion receded, Dean collapsed, gasping, his body trembling uncontrollably. The hum was still there, but now it was internalized, a quiet, constant thrum beneath the surface of his thoughts. He pushed himself up, his limbs heavy, his head aching with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The factory was still there, the broken machinery, the dripping roof, but everything was different. He stumbled out of the derelict factory, into the pre-dawn gloom. The storm had broken. The island felt alive. Dean looked at his hands. He walked back towards the cottage, the rising sun painting the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and sickly orange. He was no longer just Dean, the reclusive cartographer. The island was safe for now, but his mind, his very soul, was a fractured mirror, reflecting the terrible, ancient truths of the deep.